The wind that moved across the dry Wyoming plains seemed quieter around James Holloway's ranch. Once, it had carried laughter, the whinny of horses, and the joyful bark of a blue heeler running circles around a girl with golden braids. Now, it carried only silence, silence so thick it pressed down on the cabin like snow. The land, once tended and loved, now looked tired. Fences leaned like old men, fields grew wild with weeds, and the barn door hung crooked on rusted hinges. But James didn't see any of that anymore. He only saw the past and the grave he had yet to finish. Inside the cabin, the air was stale with memories. Dust gathered on the shelves where schoolbooks still sat, their corners folded and pages marked with drawings of horses and wildflowers. On the mantel sat a cracked photo frame of a girl grinning from ear to ear, her arms wrapped around a foal she had helped deliver. Lily, his daughter, his whole world. James had built the ranch with her in mind, every nail and beam a promise, that she'd grow up strong, free, and surrounded by the life she loved. But promises meant nothing to Rivers and nothing to fate. It had happened in spring, during the thaw. One of the riverbanks broke unexpectedly, and the water surged like a monster. Billy had been riding to check the cattle and never saw it coming. By the time James reached her, there was nothing left to save. He buried her under the big cottonwood tree where she used to read, marked the spot with a simple cross, and let the world unravel. He stopped going to church. He stopped going into town. Neighbors came at first offering casseroles, prayers, and pitiful glances, but he sent them away. He didn't want their sympathy. He wanted his daughter back. Each day since, James followed the same quiet routine. He woke with the sun, but not for chores. The horses hadn't been saddled in months. He fed the chickens. Sometimes, other times he forgot. His cattle roamed wild now. He figured nature would do what it did best. Instead of working, he walked, out past the barn, beyond the creek, to a patch of land where the soil was soft. And there he dug. It wasn't a deep hole, not yet. Some days he only managed a few scoops. Other days he stood motionless with the shovel in hand, staring at the ground like it might answer for all the things it had taken. He didn't call it a grave out loud, but he knew what it was. He wasn't planting a garden. He wasn't preparing for a cellar. James Holloway had lost the only reason he had to keep going. And now, he was simply preparing for the end quietly, slowly, like a man folding himself into the earth. Meals were little more than stale bread and black coffee. Rarely lit a lamp at night. He spoke aloud only when muttering to Lily's ghost, asking questions no one could answer. "What do I do now?" he'd whisper to the dark. "How do I keep breathing when you're not here?" Sometimes he thought he heard her laugh on the wind, or saw her shape in the shifting shadows of the trees. But always, he woke up alone. Didn't know how much time had passed. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into a numb stretch of months. Grief didn't follow a calendar. It swallowed whole seasons and spat them out as cold echoes. The land around him suffered 2 crops untended, tools rusting, the ranch falling into the same kind of disrepair that grief causes in a soul. James knew what people said, that he'd gone mad, that he was waiting to die. He didn't care. Let them talk. Let the world move on without him. His world had already ended. He didn't know that something, or rather someone, was coming. 5 someones, actually, and they were about to step onto his land like a wind that stirred the dust and cracked open something that had long since been buried. But for now, James sat in his worn wooden chair, eyes locked on the empty one across the table, the chair where Lily used to sit, swinging her legs and talking about horses and dreams and tomorrow. There were no more tomorrows in James Holloway's heart. At least, not yet. The evening air settled thick over the ranch, like a wool blanket pulled too tight. James was outside again, leaning on his shovel, eyes fixed on the same patch of half-dug earth he'd been staring at for weeks. The soil was dry, stubborn, and cracked, resisting him as stubbornly as he resisted life itself. Behind him, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of amber and wine. Somewhere far off, a coyote yelped. The world, as usual, felt empty. That was when he saw it movement. Along the far ridge, just beyond the line where his property met the wild scrubland. At first, he thought it was animals, antelope, maybe, but the shapes didn't dart or scatter. They moved with slow, deliberate steps, upright, human. James squinted, unsure whether his eyes were betraying him. He hadn't seen a soul on his land in months, not since the pastor came knocking and left with silence instead of confession. That as the figures drew nearer, James lowered the shovel, his breath caught somewhere between suspicion and disbelief. They weren't riders, no wagons, no adults, just children, 5 of them, walking in a quiet line, each carrying a sack or small bundle slung over one shoulder. Dirt streaked their cheeks, and their clothes were patched and faded from the sun. The oldest, perhaps 12, led them, her chin lifted in a way that looked more practiced than natural. The youngest couldn't have been more than 5, her tiny frame leaning against the girl in front of her with each tired step. They stopped at the edge of his fence, lying timid, silent, staring at him like ghosts, unsure of their welcome. James didn't move. His first instinct was to send them away. He wasn't a man who took in strays, especially not now. especially not children. His heart, brittle as old timber, couldn't handle more cracks. He had no use for visitors, especially ones who reminded him of what he'd lost. But something in their eyes held him in place. Not fear, not desperation, just waiting, as if they already knew that his land was where they needed to be. The tallest girl stepped forward and rested her hand gently on the fence post. "Sir," she said, her voice hoarse from thirst or long silence. "We don't mean harm, she faltered, looking down at her worn shoes. "We didn't know where else to go." James stared at her, heart pounding in his ears. He couldn't speak, couldn't ask who they were, where they'd come from, or what had happened to the parents they clearly no longer had. The answers felt too big, too heavy, and maybe, somewhere deep inside, he didn't want to hear them. It was easier to live in a world that asked nothing of him. But there, they stood 5 girls who looked like they'd wandered out of the pages of some dust-covered Bible tale, orphaned and tired, with no place to belong. He glanced back at the cabin. There were enough blankets to lay on the floor, enough food for a night, maybe 2. He didn't make a decision, not aloud. He just nodded once and turned toward the porch, expecting them to follow if they had the strength. And they did. Inside. The girls sat quietly around the old pine table. James set out a cold pot of beans and what remained of yesterday's cornbread. The girls ate slowly, gratefully, as if careful not to offend the silence that wrapped the room, like smoke. The little one, with a bruise on her wrist and hair tangled in knots, fell asleep in her chair. Another gently pulled her into her lap and rocked her, humming a lullaby James hadn't heard in decades. He didn't ask their names. They didn't ask why he lived alone, or why he looked like a man whose soul had gone missing. It was an unspoken agreement that for one night, maybe 2, they would share this broken space. Later, as James lay awake on the edge of sleep, he heard soft breathing from the other room. For the first time in months, the ranch didn't feel entirely dead. And though the grave still waited outside in the dark, he didn't visit it that night. He stayed in bed, eyes on the ceiling, heart heavy but no longer completely hollow. Something had changed. They were here now. The next morning arrived with a pale gray sky and a hush over the land, as though even the wind dared not disturb what had settled the night before. James Holloway stood at the edge of the porch, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon like a sentry unsure whether to hope or brace. Behind him, inside the cabin, 5 small souls still slept, or maybe pretended to. He didn't know yet which hand. He didn't ask. He wasn't sure what to do now. All he knew was that the weight in his chest had shifted, just a little, and it was both unfamiliar and uncomfortable. They hadn't left. That was the first surprise. James had half expected or perhaps hoped that the girls would vanish at dawn, disappearing as mysteriously as they'd arrived. Maybe they were just passing through, he told himself. Maybe they were the problem of the next town down the road. He wasn't built for this. He'd already failed 1 child. How could he be trusted with 5? But when he returned from feeding the chickens and dumping a scoop of cracked corn, he saw them again huddled in the same corner of the cabin they had claimed as their own. Blankets tucked around them, their small forms still and exhausted. The tall girl, Clara, blinked up at him as he walked in, her expression unreadable. She looked like someone who had learned too early how to study people before speaking. It reminded James of himself. "Thank you for the beans," she said. Voice rough. James only nodded and moved toward the stove. He poured coffee into a chipped enamel mug, the scrape of the metal pot against the iron grates breaking the quiet. For a few moments, that was all there was, the hiss of the fire, the steam rising, the silence of girls waiting to see if they were still welcome. He didn't say a word, and neither did they. Breakfast was modest. Old biscuits with honey, a couple of hard-boiled eggs. James placed it on the table without ceremony. The girls ate with the same quiet gratitude as before. No one begged for more. No one asked for less. James watched them from the corner of his eye, hands wrapped around his coffee, unsure what rules were forming between them. As the day wore on, they stayed. That was the second surprise. One of the girls, Mary, he learned later, began to sweep the floor without being asked. She found an old broom in the corner and moved carefully around the chairs and crates, her motions small and rhythmic. Ruthie, the one who had hummed the night before, began folding blankets with surprising care, smoothing the edges like she'd been taught by someone who insisted on order. It struck James, then these girls had been raised to survive. They hadn't come looking for charity. They had come looking for something else, a place where they could matter. Still, he kept his distance. He wasn't ready for questions. He didn't ask where their parents were or how they ended up on his land. The girls didn't volunteer anything. It was as if they all knew, wordlessly, that the story would come when it was ready. For now, they existed in a kind of truce's silence and their presence, overlapping in a fragile balance neither wanted to break. That night, he made up 5 crude beds in the back room, old hay covered in faded quilts and worn-out pillows that had once belonged to Lily. The girls didn't complain. They thanked him softly and settled in like they expected nothing more. James lit a lamp and stood in the hallway for a long time afterward, listening to them whisper in the dark. Not secrets, just memories. One girl was talking about a bird she'd once seen with feathers like fire. Another asked if the stars looked different in other places. And James listened. It had been months since he'd heard voices in his house that weren't echoes. Months since he'd felt the rhythm of life tiny as it was inside the walls of his home. He didn't smile, he didn't weep. He just stood there, watching the light flicker against the wooden frame of the door, and wondered what exactly he had just let in. Not just 5 girls, but something else. Something like hope. In the days that followed, a subtle rhythm began to take hold at the Holloway Ranch, a rhythm that James neither planned for nor resisted. It crept in quietly, the way sunrise does through a dusty window, soft, uninvited, but impossible to ignore. Where once the cabin echoed with silence and the clatter of a single plate, now there were footsteps, whispers, even giggles muffled under quilts at night. The air felt different. Not lighter, grief was still there but alive. And though James wouldn't have said it aloud, not even to himself, it almost resembled healing. The girls didn't behave like guests. They didn't lounge about waiting for direction. Instead, they filled the hollow spaces of the ranch the way water finds its way into dry riverbeds naturally. Instinctively, Clara, the oldest, took to organizing small chores. Without a word from James, she patched a tear in one of the feed sacks and restacked the woodpile by the door. Mary, quiet and precise, swept the porch every morning before breakfast. Ruthie found a place among the chickens, softly humming to them while she scattered feed. Sarah, the smallest of them all, followed Ruthie like a shadow, often with a twig or wildflower tucked behind her ear. James observed all of it from a quiet distance. He still rose early and walked the land, checking fences, watering the few crops he hadn't entirely given up on. The shovel still rested near the half-dug grave, but he hadn't touched it since the girls arrived. He told himself he simply hadn't had time. But the truth was harder to swallow. He no longer felt entirely ready to finish it. In the barn, tools began to shift back into order. One afternoon, without asking permission, Clara picked up a hammer and began repairing the slanting barn door. James caught her mid-swing. For a moment, he opened his mouth to stop her, maybe scold her, but the look she gave him froze the words on his tongue. It wasn't defiance, it was need. The need to be useful, to fix something, anything, when so much had been broken already. She's good with her hands, James muttered later that evening to no one in particular as he watched her from the porch. Real good. His voice cracked slightly as it left his lips, as if unused to forming praise. There was still no talk of the girl's past. James didn't push. He knew pain had a timeline of its own. He saw it in their eyes, the way Clara watched the road as if expecting something terrible, or how Sarah flinched at sudden loud noises. Trauma lived in the small details, and James knew enough about grief to understand that sometimes naming it too soon only made the hurt louder. But there were glimpses, moments that peeled back the mystery like worn lace curtains fluttering in the wind. One afternoon, Ruthie traced the outline of Lily's picture frame with her fingers and asked, "Was she your daughter?" James only nodded, voice stuck in his throat. Ruthie didn't press. She just placed a small daisy beside the frame before walking away, a gesture so gentle it nearly broke him. Mealtimes shifted from silent endurance to quiet ritual. James still cooked, old habits held firm, but the girls began to help. Clara learned how to season the beans better than he ever had. Mary baked biscuits without burning the bottoms. And Sarah, messy and mischievous, once got into the flour and coated her face white as a ghost, sending the others into fits of laughter that filled the room like sunlight through the windows. James didn't laugh, but he smiled. A small, worn smile. It felt like a betrayal at first, like laughing at a funeral. But even sorrow can't drown everything forever. The heart has ways of opening, even when we try to board it shut. One evening, while walking past the edge of the cottonwood grove where Lily was buried, James stopped and looked down at the grave. He didn't weep. He didn't kneel. He simply whispered, "They're not you, darlin', but there's something." And in that fragile whisper lived a truth he hadn't dared say aloud until now. Maybe he didn't have to die to be near Lily. Maybe by living truly, living, he could carry her forward, even if the path looked different than he'd imagined, because something was changing. Slowly, quietly, and it had started the moment 5 orphan girls stepped out of the wild and into his world. It was late spring when the storm rolled in, a dark, swirling mass of clouds that painted the sky charcoal and turned the prairie wind cold. James had seen plenty of weather in his life, but this one felt different, heavier somehow, like it wasn't just a storm in the sky, but in the bones of the land itself. The clouds moved low and fast over the hills, and the air held the kind of silence that came before a reckoning. That afternoon, James was in the barn, repairing a cracked wheelbarrow, when he caught the scent of rain on the wind. He stepped outside, wiped his hands on his jeans, and scanned the horizon. Clara was gathering eggs in the coop. Ruthie and Mary were stringing up clothes to dry. Sarah and Hannah, the shyest of the girls, sat cross-legged near the porch, whispering over an old tin box they'd found beneath the floorboards. "Inside, all of you," James called out, voice firm but calm. The girls froze for a moment, exchanging looks, then hurried to obey. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. There was something about the way he said it that reminded them he knew storms well. As they bustled into the cabin, James moved fast, tied down the feed bags, shuttered the windows, doubled the water barrel. He found Mary already helping secure the front latch, her small fingers trembling as she worked beside him. She didn't say a word, but when their eyes met, James gave her a nod of approval. She returned it with something that might have been pride. The storm hit just after dusk. The wind roared through the valley like a freight train, slamming branches against the cabin walls and tearing through the fields. Lightning cracked in the distance, close enough to illuminate the faces of the girls as they huddled together, wrapped in blankets, eyes wide. The fire in the hearth flickered but held steady, thanks to James's careful stacking of the wood and Ruthie's attentive tending. For a while, no one spoke. The rain beat down on the roof, relentless and loud. Thunder rolled over the hills, like war drums. The youngest, Hannah, whimpered and curled into Ruthie's lap. Sarah buried her face in Clara's shoulder. Even James, though calm on the outside, felt the sharp jab of old memories stir within the kind that involved storms, loss, and long nights spent alone, with nothing but the sound of grief for company. But this night was different. He wasn't alone anymore. As the storm surged, James pulled an old oil lantern from a shelf and placed it at the center of the table. The girls gathered around it instinctively, drawn to the warmth, to the light, to each other. There was something ancient about the way they sat there like a family, though none of them would have called it that yet. James sat, too, across from them, not speaking. Just there it was Ruthie who broke the silence. She began humming again, that same lullaby she always used when comforting Hannah. Slowly, her voice grew louder, and then Clara joined in. Then Mary, and finally, Serenamid, off-key, but brave. Their voices blended softly over the storm, not to drown it out, but to rise above it. James closed his eyes. For a moment, it was as if Lily was sitting beside him, her hand resting gently on his, the way she used to when thunder frightened her as a child. He could almost hear her voice among theirs. It struck him deep pain and comfort mingled in a way that left him speechless. The storm raged on through the night, but inside that cabin, something powerful took root, a sense of shared strength, trust, shelter not just from the weather, but from the ache of what they'd all lost. When dawn finally cracked the sky open again, the storm was gone. It left behind broken branches, flooded patches of earth, and soaked linens, but it also left something else, a feeling that they had survived together, that this place, once haunted by silence and sorrow, had become something sturdier, something alive. James stepped outside, boots sinking into the wet ground, and breathed deeply. The air was clean, the kind of clean that comes only after something wild has passed through. Behind him, the door creaked, and he turned to see Clara holding Sarah's hand, smiling at him, not seeking permission, just connection. And for the first time since Lily's passing, James didn't brace himself against the world. He opened the door wider. The storm marked a turning point not just in the weather, but in James Holloway's soul. In the days that followed, something inside him softened. As if the thunder had shaken loose the rusted hinges on the doors he had long kept locked. The girls were no longer strangers occupying his home. They had become something else entirely. The ranch, once burdened by sorrow and silence, now pulsed with a quiet energy. Not noise, exactly, but presence. And presence, James realized, was louder than grief ever was. Clara began to spend more time by James's side. Not in the way children trail adults for attention, but in a way that was watchful, respectful, even helpful. She'd taken to walking the fence line with him in the mornings, learning how to check the posts, spot weaknesses, and hammer the nails when boards gave way. She never asked for praise, but James offered it anyway, sparingly, awkwardly at first. "Good eye," he'd mutter, when she spotted a loose rail before he did. "You've got hands like your daddy must have had," he once said, without knowing whether it was true. Clara didn't answer, but the next morning, she handed him his gloves before he asked. Ruthie and Mary found joy in the garden James had, mostly abandoned. The soil had gone hard with neglect, and weeds had claimed most of the rows, but the girls attacked it like a challenge, kneeling in the dirt, digging with spoons when tools weren't enough, clearing 1 square foot at a time. By the end of the week, green shoots were poking through the soil, beans, onions, even a single proud tomato plant. Ruthie spoke to them as she worked, singing lullabies to seedlings as though they were children themselves. "I think they grow better when they're not scared," she explained once, without looking up. James didn't know how to respond to that, but he didn't argue. Meanwhile, Sarah and Hannah gravitated toward Lily's old room, which James had left untouched since the funeral. At first, he had kept the door closed, a shrine of memory too painful to cross. But one afternoon, he caught Sarah sitting just outside the door, tracing the grain of the wood with her fingertips. She didn't try to open it. She didn't ask questions. She just sat there, gently leaning against it as though the space beyond held a story she understood without needing to hear it. It took James 3 more days before he opened that door himself. He found her dolls still on the shelf, her drawings, yellowed by time, the pressed flowers she'd once collected dry and crumbling in a tin box. He didn't cry, but he stood there for a long time. Then he brought Sarah in and let her pick one of the dolls. Just one. Her smile said everything. Words, COULDN. Single quotes T. Evenings grew longer as spring melted into summer. The girls helped prepare dinner without being asked, and James taught them how to make cornbread the way his own mother had. Sometimes they told stories around the fire. Other times, they simply sat in companionable silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Once, James read from a dusty old book Clara had found in the barn, his voice stiff at first, but growing more confident as he watched their eyes widen at each chapter's turn. There were setbacks, too. Nights when Hannah cried out from nightmares, her small body trembling with memories she couldn't explain. Times when Mary would flinch at sudden footsteps, or when Clara would go silent and stare out the window for hours. James didn't try to fix those moments, he just stayed close, a steady presence. And sometimes that was enough. He realized, one evening, watching them chase fireflies near the barn, that he had stopped thinking about dying. Not because the pain of losing Lily was gone, it never would be, but because something new had taken root in its place. Responsibility, connection, purpose. He wasn't just sheltering them, they were saving him, too. And as he leaned against the old porch post, the sun dipping low behind the hills, he allowed himself to think of tomorrow not as a burden, but as a gift. By midsummer, word had started to travel. Not loudly, not through headlines or telegrams, but in the quiet, gossipy way. Things spread through prairie towns, between flour sacks in the general store, through the pews of church halls, and across cracked porches in the cool of evening. Folks spoke of James Holloway, the grief-racked rancher who once stopped speaking to his neighbors and nearly vanished from their memory. But now, they whispered of laughter echoing through the Holloway Valley, of 5 young girls chasing chickens and hanging laundry on lines that had sagged for years. They spoke of something impossible, life returning to a place once defined by loss. James wasn't unaware. He saw the looks when he rode into town for supplies, to half curious, half skeptical glances from folks who used to cross the street. Rather than meet his eye, now, they gave him slow nods, cautious greetings, sometimes even a hesitant smile. But what unsettled him most wasn't the attention. It was the questions. "You talkin' in Orphans now, Holloway?" Old Mr. Crawley had asked, half joking but not unkind. James had only replied, "Just taking care of who showed up." But deeper than that, deeper than town gossip or cautious curiosity, was the question he'd begun to ask himself more often, with every passing week: what now? Because this arrangement, unspoken, informal, and born of desperation, couldn't last forever. The girls had no legal status, no guardianship papers, no one formally assigning them to his care. They had simply clung to his land, and he hadn't let them go. One morning, a rider came up the trail. James saw the dust first, then the shape of a man on horseback, officially looking too well dressed for a ranch visit. James stepped off the porch slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, heart tightening. The girls stood behind the screen door, silent, watching. "Name's Thompson," the man said as he dismounted. "County Welfare Office." He held out a badge and a folder that looked too thin to matter, yet heavy enough to destroy everything. James didn't speak at first. He just nodded once and led the man to the porch. The girls didn't come out, but their eyes never left the conversation. Thompson wasn't harsh. He wasn't here to cause harm. He asked questions: how long the girls had been here, what James knew about them, what arrangements had been made. James answered honestly. No arrangements, no plans, just 5 girls who showed up on a day when he'd almost buried himself, and gave him a reason not to. The welfare officer listened. He wrote things down. He looked around at the neat porch, the mended barn, the clothes drying on the line. Then he said something James didn't expect. "They're healthy, fed, safe, happier than they probably were before." From the looks of it, James nodded again, cautious. But that's not always enough, Mr. Holloway. Not on paper. It was the paper, the law, the rules. I couldn't see what James saw. The way Clara looked at him like a father, the way Sarah slipped her hand into his without thinking, the way they had stitched themselves into the fabric of his broken life. Paper didn't measure that. Thompson sighed and looked him straight in the eye. "You've got time," he said, "but not forever. If you want them to stay, you'll have to make it official." After he rode off, James sat on the porch long after the dust had settled. The girls emerged slowly, silently, as if unsure whether they still belonged. He looked at each of them, 5 sets of eyes holding 5 different kinds of fear. "I ain't sending anybody away," he said finally. His voice was gravelly, but firm. "Not now, not ever." Clara stepped forward. "What do we have to do?" James looked toward the horizon, then back at them. "We make this real." That night, as the sun dipped behind the hills, James opened the old family Bible for the first time in years. Inside were pages for family records, births, deaths, marriages. He turned to the section labeled Children. With a trembling hand, he began to write. The autumn wind swept gently through the valley, golden leaves dancing across the porch like little blessings from the trees. It had been 6 months since the girls arrived, 6 months since James Holloway had dug what he thought would be his own grave. But now the shovel leaned against the barn wall, rusted and untouched. In its place, 5 pairs of boots stood beside the cabin door. Different sizes, different colors, but all lined up neatly, just the way the girls had started, doing without ever being asked. Inside the house, warmth glowed from within. The fireplace crackled. Potatoes simmered on the stove. Laughter, a sound once foreign in these rooms, now flowed freely, like a river unblocked. The cabin had changed in quiet ways. The walls were decorated with childlike drawings. The table had 6 chairs instead of 1. A calendar hung near the pantry with names written in different handwriting. Clara's chore day, Ruthie's turn to feed the chickens, Hannah's bedtime story, Grandpa's pick yes grandpa, that had started 2 weeks ago, when Sarah, without realizing it, had called him that aloud. She'd frozen immediately afterward, waiting for correction or disapproval, but James had only smiled. You can call me whatever makes you feel safe, he had said, and it stuck. Now the name passed between them easily. Not forced, not rehearsed, just true. The paperwork had been filed. Clara helped him sign his name. Ruthie had picked out the family photo they submitted, the one where James was holding Hannah in one arm and trying not to drop a squirming chicken with the other. Mary and Sarah helped choose the middle names they wanted added. The county judge, when he finalized the guardianship, had paused before speaking. You may not be blood, the judge had said, but this is a family. Mr. Holloway. Clear as day. It was official. The girls were his. The day the documents arrived in the mail, James had sat in the barn alone for a while, holding the papers in his calloused hands. Not crying, exactly, but feeling something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Pride, not the kind that shouted, the kind that settled into your chest like a warm stone. He looked up then and saw the old photograph of Lily on the wall, her tiny smile, her bright eyes. He whispered, they would have liked you, sweetheart. Outside, Clara and Mary were working on repairing the chicken coop. Sarah was helping Hannah learn to read, using an old primer book James had dug out of a trunk. Ruthie, barefoot in the field, twirled with her arms wide, chasing the wind. The land had come alive again, not just because of crops or chores or repairs, but because love, once buried under grief, had been unearthed. That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table. The food was simple pot roast beans, cornbread, but it tasted better than any meal James could remember. They bowed their heads to say grace, and for the first time, it was James who spoke. Thank you, he said softly, for giving this old man another chance. After dinner, as twilight crept across the hills, the girls begged for a story. James opened the same book Lily used to love and began to read, his voice low and steady. As he read, 5 sleepy heads slowly began to nod off. One by one, they leaned against his arms, his sides, and finally, Hannah curled into his lap. He didn't move. He didn't want to. Outside, the stars blinked into view. The ranch was quiet again, not the heavy silence of sorrow, but the peaceful hush of a home at rest. For the first time in what felt like forever, James wasn't haunted by what he had lost. He was blessed by what had found him, and in that moment, with 5 girls asleep around him and the memory of his daughter gently resting in his heart, James Holloway knew something sacred had taken root in his life. Not a replacement, not a fix, but a purpose, something worth living for.